Welcome to the Facts. I'm Mike Austad, and this week we will be talking about 3 of the 10 ballot issues that will be facing South Dakota voters on Tuesday, November 8th. And with those 3, I have my guest, Justin Smith, attorney in South Dakota. Justin, welcome to the Facts.
Thank you very much.
Tell us a little bit about your background and what you do with the law here in South Dakota.
Sure. I'm an attorney. I've been practicing law for 10 years here in South Dakota. I grew up kind of all over the world. My dad was in the Army. But then after I met my wife at college in Virginia, I moved here to Sioux Falls in 2006, and I've been practicing since then at Woods, Fuller, Schultz & Smith Law Firm here in Sioux Falls.
Okay. And you do some work, you have some background on these issues, you do some work in peer and at the state level as well?
I do, yep.
Okay.
I have a business law practice outside of the session, a little bit of litigation here and there, but then I have a government relations practice as well. So part of that is lobbying on behalf of my clients out at the legislative session during peer, and then some administrative law, some regulatory work, those kinds of issues as part of my government relations practice.
Okay, well, excellent. You'll help us out here on 3 of those issues that will be. Let's start off with Constitutional Amendment V. That's where there's opening up the primaries. Tell us a little bit about that and what that means as a constitutional amendment of what South Dakota voters will be voting on.
Certainly. Amendment V was initiated by the people with a petition that gathered enough signatures to put it on the ballot. And there's a lot of people who call it the nonpartisan primary amendment to our Constitution. That's actually a little bit of misleading. It would actually institute nonpartisan elections across the board. So both primaries and in the general election would be nonpartisan. There'd be no party affiliations listed on the ballot, and there would not be partisan primaries to get to the general election. Everyone would go into the same pool of candidates. All those names would be on the ballot. You know, if it's for governor, it could be, maybe upwards of 10, 12 candidates, all in the same pool, no party affiliations listed. And then the top 2 vote getters would advance to the general election, where again, no party affiliation would be listed on the ballot.
Okay. Now, with all these issues facing South Dakota voters, what is the significance of it being a constitutional amendment?
Certainly, very good question. Constitutional amendment is much more difficult to change and impacts South Dakota state law on a much bigger level. In fact, initiated measures put in place new statutes or changes to existing statutes. This would actually amend the South Dakota Constitution. So if we ever wanted to change anything put in place by Amendment V, we would have to again amend our Constitution, and probably that would have to go to a citizen vote again to change anything.
Okay, so as it stands, there's the parties have a competition in a primary, say on a state legislative race, so they'll have the 2 candidates that will get their petition signed. They'll run for a state office, for example, and they will have their party ID named in a primary where voters from their designated party get the chance to choose in the primary.
That's correct.
The winners of that primary go to the general election, which everybody will vote for. Some of the opponents of the current issue that do want Amendment V, some independent voters, maybe there's a former Sioux Falls mayor who's pro-changing in support of Amendment V, says as it stands there are independent voters that are disenfranchised or they don't have a voice. What is that challenge all about?
Yep. Good question. If you look at the pro-Amendment V website, the Yes on V website, they actually use the term independents are locked out of South Dakota elections, and that's incorrect. There are about 115,000 registered independent voters in South Dakota. Independents, it's a fact, may vote in Democrat primaries. In addition, if there's a primary between 2 nonpartisan candidates, so 2 independents, they could vote in that primary election as well. In addition, independents are permitted to vote in all general elections. So whether they're it's Republican versus Democrat, whatever it is in the general election, they get to vote on that ballot.
So even at these 115,000 independent registered voters in South Dakota, they can get petitions and get on to run for a state office.
Absolutely.
And they can still campaign during even primary season, which they might not be a part of,
Yep.
and compete for the general election.
That's absolutely correct. In fact, Many would say that they have an even better position than partisan candidates because they're just automatically going to go onto the general election ballot in the fall.
So you're saying that that's an advantage. They don't have to spend money in primaries as much, or resources maybe to the degree?
Arguably, right. Arguably could be an advantage, but it's definitely something where they don't have to worry about the primary because they're an independent. They're going to go on the ballot.
And there's some charges for the pro-amendment V that this erases identification and it's subterfuge. It hides the label because these candidates will not have their affiliation. Republicans and independents and Democrats will all field, but they won't have their designation party to their name on that. Is that what I gather?
Yep, that's exactly correct. In fact, the term used by the opponents of Amendment V is lack of transparency. It removes transparency on the ballot. As a voter, I don't think I would ever imagine a situation where I would want less information about the candidates for whom I'm voting when I go into the ballot booth. And in addition, I think it's pretty plainly obvious that we, the people, should probably have an idea of the faction or political party to whom we are handing over control of state government in South Dakota. This takes those affiliations off the ballot.
Okay. There's other states that have precedent. They search to point to California. And some of those Senate races, there's up to over 30 candidates on this open primary, which is essentially what Amendment V, if passed, would do. So you could have up to 30 or plus candidates with no affiliation. How is that a problem?
Well, good question. You absolutely could have as many candidates as possible on the primary election ballot. Now, one interesting point, I do want to come back to Nebraska and California. They're two big examples. One interesting point that has actually caused a number of Democrats and Republicans and even some independents and libertarians to come out against Amendment V, or saying that it won't help third-party candidates, is that you could easily calculate a situation where for governor, Secretary of State, Attorney General, there are only Republican options on the general election ballot because everyone's in the same pool, no party affiliations, and nothing in Amendment V would prevent a situation where, Joe Smith and Jane Doe, both of whom are Republicans, are the top two vote getters, and those are the ones who advance to the general election. The Democrats don't have an option. Independents, libertarians don't have an option, and they're just out of luck. They have to choose between two Republican candidates in the general election.
Okay, so that by default, that could be a choice where it's just one party.
That's exactly correct. And in a deeply red state, a deeply Republican state like South Dakota, where the Democrat Party, it's documented fact, continues to gradually lose registered voters, and the Republican Party gradually is gaining voters, although not as quickly as independents, registered independents. That, I think, is a likely situation.
Okay. South Dakota is a small state. It might be viewed as a state where these issues have nationwide attention and are more affordable and more cheaper to convince with advertising. A smaller state. So we're attracting more of that. Where do you see that this money or the campaigns coming from? There's accusations of dark money funding some of these races. Tell us a little bit about the dark money organizations. What do they mean by that?
Certainly. Typically when someone involved in politics throws out the term dark money, what they are referring to is there's money being funneled into a particular political campaign, including a ballot question committee, which is coming from sources that are either kept secret until reports are filed or are out-of-state dollars that have no ties to South Dakota whatsoever, and in particular, mega PACs or super PACs that are out to advocate for a particular cause or a particular political party. Now, in this case, in South Dakota, what you've got is a group called Open Primaries. And actually, if you go to the Yes on V campaign website, you look through their website, they've got a nice little graphic video which has got some information on what the point is of nonpartisan elections, how it would benefit people. That is directly from the YouTube page for the Open Primaries group. And they've made no secret about the fact. They filed their campaign finance reports, and they do indeed receive the bulk, if not most, if not all of their money from out-of-state organizations, particularly this open primaries and some other organizations.
So these donors are hidden somewhat.
Yes, they're hidden because they donate to the open primaries group, which files its own reports probably at the federal level, and then that open primaries group is the one that is funding and driving predominantly the Yes on V campaign. And as an example of that, one of the main arguments that they make on the Yes on V website is, well, this would send a message to Washington, D.C. that Americans are tired of partisan gridlock, of partisan politics, etc. Well, I got to tell you, the South Dakota State Chamber of Commerce has actually come out in opposition to Amendment V because, to quote them, South Dakota is a state with a functioning government, no gridlock, a strong economy, and that balances its budget every single time. Government works in South Dakota, and so why we would use South Dakota to send this message, whatever it might be, to Washington, D.C. just seems silly to me, particularly when before Amendment V came here and open primaries brought it, no one in South Dakota was ever asking for nonpartisan elections. There was never a bill introduced in Pierre for nonpartisan elections in South Dakota. And there was no citizen group that was pushing this kind of agenda. So this is a fresh thing that's come into our state, and you're absolutely right. Using our relatively easy ballot measure process to put this on our ballot and then potentially onto our state constitution.
Okay, very good. We'll be back with more Amendment V information and 2 other measures on the facts.
Giving crime victims equal rights. That's what Amendment S, Marcy's Law, will do. As a prosecutor, I've seen firsthand how crime victims and their families are too often forgotten about during the criminal justice process. We can change that. Amendment S provides victims with equal rights they deserve. The right to privacy, to be heard, notified, and free of harassment. Stand up for South Dakota crime victims. Vote yes on Amendment S, Marcy's Law.
Working South Dakotans, watch your pocketbooks. You've never been forced to pay membership dues or fees for services to a union. It's always been your choice. That's right to work. If passed, initiated Measure 23 will allow unions to charge you their fees, whether you want to pay them or not. Vote no on initiated Measure 23 and keep control of your pocketbook, paid for by the No on 23 Committee.
Welcome back to The Facts. We're here with Justin Smith, continuing the issue of Amendment V, one of the 10 ballot measures that will be facing South Dakota voters, and a couple other amendments later. But continuing with Amendment V, there's other states that have followed suit, an example of removing the primary affiliation in primary races. Nebraska and California are cited too. Tell us a little bit about maybe a Nebraska comparison.
Absolutely. In fact, there's a huge section of the Yes on V website which is dedicated to saying the Nebraska system works. Well, comparing Amendment V to Nebraska is completely unfair for several reasons, one of which is because they are correct. Nebraska has nonpartisan elections for its legislature. And that's because its legislature is nonpartisan. It's a unicameral, nonpartisan legislature. And so, of course, the elections for that branch are going to be nonpartisan by definition. In addition, every other elected office in the state of Nebraska, governor, secretary of state, etc., are partisan primary elections that list the party affiliation of those candidates on the ballot. Nebraska holds its primary in May, and then in November holds its general election. The comparison to California doesn't work because while California does have open primaries where all candidates go on the same primary ballot, party affiliations are still listed on the California ballot.
Okay, so in the other examples, there's still primary party affiliation named.
Yep.
And in Nebraska, the legislature there, one chamber only, doesn't even have the partisan contest to begin with.
No. And one of the things they say is that government works in Nebraska. Government works really well, and they tout Nebraska as being somewhere that's very effective. Well, the fact of the matter is, one of the other quotes they give is, quote, "Government has never been more dysfunctional." Well, they're not talking about South Dakota. We're a state that continues to get top marks in virtually every category, from politician approval ratings, where our state governor, who is Republican, was recently, according to a national study, named as the governor with the highest approval rating in the country, from economy to job growth to credit worthiness, our pension fund, everything. Pierre, South Dakota is not California, is not Washington, D.C.
Okay. Now, how do we get this far to a constitutional amendment? It's easy to target a smaller state. We've talked about that. Is there something that could be done legislatively, and if so, has it been done and not seen as a necessity?
That's actually an excellent question. One of the main arguments, we talked about this, is the independents are locked out. That seems to be their main rallying cry, and to be honest, it is their best talking point. Saying independents cannot vote in Republican primaries is true, but the simplest solution is the best solution. Why don't we introduce a bill in Pierre that says no political party may close its primary elections and thereby allow independents to vote in the Democrat and Republican primaries? Now, that might not pass, but it hasn't even been proposed in Pierre. So why are we skipping from nothing, and again, no citizen in South Dakota, no group asking for open elections or nonpartisan elections? We skip all the way to putting a constitutional amendment on there, which in addition to granting independents the right to vote, makes all of these other sweeping changes to our election laws.
And when a constitutional amendment passes, it limits legislators, the governor or the state, to make changes without a lot of process.
That's absolutely correct. The only way we could do it is either by the legislature proposing a constitutional amendment and giving it to the people to vote on it, or the people, once again, coming back with an initiated measure to put the constitutional amendment on the ballot. So it has to go to a citizen vote if we want to amend our South Dakota Constitution.
So what you're saying is that the attempts in the state and the history of the legislature meeting, it has not come up through statewide interest to change these.
I looked into it. It is possible that there has been some kind of proposal made to change these that I couldn't find, but no, I have not. I don't know of one, at least in the 6 years that I've been lobbying, and I've talked to people who don't remember anything like this being proposed, just the independence piece.
There's 10 ballot measures that are facing South Dakota voters. We've touched on Amendment V. Let's go on a couple of initiated measures. One is the Initiated Measure 22, which is the redirecting financing for political campaigns. This is very interesting. A lot of pages involved in this measure. Tell us about an initiated measure as compared to, say, a constitutional amendment.
Certainly. An initiated measure has a signature requirement which is comparable, but I think it is harder to get a constitutional amendment put onto the ballot. But regardless, an initiated measure would put new statutes in place or would make changes to existing statutes. In this case, it was a statewide campaign to gather petition signatures in favor of Initiated Measure 22. People said, the petition signature gatherers, many of whom I spoke with here in Sioux Falls, would ask people who passed them on the street, do you favor less corruption in South Dakota government? Well, that's mostly an easy question to answer. And they weren't shown the 34-page, 70-section measure, which will cost at a minimum, black and white in the measure itself, $12 million to South Dakota taxpayers.
Well, this $12 million, in the 34 pages of this proposed measure, is going to be funded by state general budget fund, tax increases, volunteer donations. Where's this money going to come from?
Excellent question. It will come directly out of the general fund. The general fund is tax revenue. Our taxpayer dollars are in the general fund. This takes the money, Section 68 of IM 22, just for everybody's reference. And that's kind of one of the dangers here is I talk to people all the time because I've been personally opposed to and fighting this measure since it was just in the petition signature phase back in the last half of 2015. And I've talked to people since then and I've said, so you want to fight corruption. Yeah, I want to rein in lobbyists. I want to fight corruption. I want an ethics commission. I've said, well, do you also want taxpayer-funded welfare for politicians? Taxpayer money funding political campaigns. And they said, well, that's not in the measure. I said, well, that's half of the sections in the measure relate to this democracy credit program. Tax dollars going into the campaign accounts of politicians to help them get elected. Even politicians who are running unopposed can get democracy credits. So this is a very dangerous proposition that there are people out there who are going to vote on a measure that By my estimate, less than 1/10 of 1% of South Dakotans who go to vote will have actually read all 34 pages.
Okay, very good. Let's continue with Initiated Measure 22 when we come back with Justin Smith on the facts.
Having a job in South Dakota has never been dependent on paying fees to a union. This freedom from forced membership, known as right to work, is part of our state constitution's Bill of Rights. If passed, Initiated Measure 23 will allow unions to charge you their fees, whether you want to pay them or not. Vote no on Initiated Measure 23 and keep South Dakota a right to work state. Paid for by the No on 23 Committee.
We're continuing our talk with the Initiated Measure 22, which is the public financing of elections. Continuing on, we talked about $12 million of tax money that will be directed out of the general fund, most likely, to pay for campaigns throughout the state.
Yep. And I'll get back to that real quick, just to mention, the fund in Initiated Measure 22 of this taxpayer money is capped at $12 million. That's permanently unavailable for the legislature to appropriate anywhere else, schools, roads, bridges, law enforcement, etc. But there is a mandatory appropriation every year in Section 68 of the measure from the general fund of $9 per registered voter. Now, according to the Secretary of State's roster of registered voters, the number, multiplying that number times $9 comes to almost $5 million every year coming from the general fund going into this special democracy credit fund.
Okay, so they got the $5 million. Are they going to automatically contribute $12 million?
No, the money will just be in there, and then the democracy credits that are drawn out of it to go to politicians to help them get elected, those draw down that $12 million account. In addition, the Ethics Commission, which we should talk about, draws its budget, which is unlimited, has no oversight, and they can do whatever they want and spend as much as they want and hire as much staff as they want. That also draws from the Democracy Credit Fund, according to the black and white text of the measure.
And is it this Ethics Commission that decides where the funds go? Or the democracy credits?
Nope. Every voter in South Dakota is assigned two $50 democracy credits. That is what the proponents keep stumping about. The fact is, if you give all 525,000 South Dakota registered voters two $50 democracy credits, that comes to over $52 million. Well, if the fund is capped at $12 million, that math doesn't seem to quite work out. Mm-hmm. So you can see where there's a little bit of a disingenuous element to all of this math that they're quoting and throwing out there.
Does this mean that the South Dakota resident could not fund in addition on their own?
They absolutely could. So one of the purported intentions of Initiated Measure 22 and of the taxpayer-funded political campaigns is to cut down on the influence of money in politics. Well, private citizens can continue to donate as much money as they want with the limits that are in the campaign finance law, but now they can also give tax dollars to politicians.
Is there precedent in other states where this has gone through?
There absolutely is, in a couple of states. However, several of those states have subsequently repealed their publicly funded campaigns. The example they hammer on a lot is the state of Maine, and they say the system works in Maine. Well, after 10 years of a taxpayer-funded political campaign system, they had to double the amount of their democracy credit fund. So that's twice the amount of taxpayer money unavailable for schools, roads, bridges, law enforcement, etc. So they may say it works in the state of Maine, but apparently after 10 years, they had to double the amount of money because it wasn't working as well as they thought it would.
Did a lot of this money that would go for democracy credits and to candidates get squeezed out by the money that went to these Ethics Commission members?
I don't think the Maine system quite worked the same way it would under Initiated Measure 22. However, there is documented evidence that in the states that have had publicly funded or taxpayer-funded political campaigns, there has been rampant corruption in a lot of those states. There has been documented evidence of politicians paying themselves, politicians embezzling taxpayer money, politicians setting up shell campaigns just so that they could get the taxpayer money, etc. And it's very interesting that who are the main spokesmen? of initiated Measure 22. 3 individuals, Rick Weiland, Daryl Solberg, and Don Frankenfeld. 2 Democrats and 1 Republican, but they all have one thing in common. They're all politicians. They've all run for and been elected to South Dakota state offices. Well, they stand to gain, if they're running for the South Dakota legislature, up to $15,000 in taxpayer money into their political campaigns if initiated Measure 22 passes. It's just an interesting side note that there are a lot of politicians pushing this measure.
And some of those have been ran and not won.
Yes.
And other offices unsuccessfully.
That's right.
With shortage of money.
Yep.
Well, let's get to that. A lot of that is they point that this is going to curb corruption. Yep. And some of the proponents of this measure refer to EB5 or some other federal things that occurred in South Dakota, Gear Up. What's their issue with that, and would this measure control or curtail those issues?
Glad you asked that question. It's one of the questions I've asked to a lot of the proponents behind Initiated Measure 22. Where is the rampant corruption that they say plagues South Dakota state government? And their answer, without fail, EB5 and Gear Up. Both of those are federal programs. Those proponents have subsequently admitted that there's nothing in Initiated Measure 22 that would have prevented what happened with the Gear Up or the EB5 situations, because state law doesn't govern federal programs like those. So as far as corruption in South Dakota politics, they point to the fact that lobbyists can give unlimited gifts to government officials. I'll tell you, I have been lobbying for 6 years. I've never given a gift to a government official. I just don't find that to be something that should be done. In addition, we already have forms that have to be filed, reports that have to be filed annually by lobbyists saying, here's the money that I spent lobbying over the past year. One of the other things they continue to hammer on is the Ethics Commission in Initiated Measure 22. They say this will help us fight corruption. Well, they gloss over the fact that we actually have had a South Dakota Ethics Commission back in the 1970s, and it was such a colossal disaster that it was repealed 4 years after it was put into effect. They also gloss over the fact that the Ethics Commission here, unlike the past one, would have immense power and its own discretion to set its own budget, which would be unlimited. It would be an appointed board of the state government, so not accountable to voters. It is also not accountable to the legislature, and it has the power to set its own budget, to punish politicians, punish candidates, punish lobbyists after investigations where it can go and gather all kinds of state records and personal documentation and financial records.
Let's briefly touch on Initiated Measure 23, which kind of has a vague description, one line for something about private organizations collecting for their work. Yeah. What is this really? This is really a union issue to, opponents say, to target right to work.
It's absolutely correct. And for a while, the proponents of the measure didn't seem like they were going to really touch on the union issue, but they've kind of gone there now. They claim, the proponents, that if you are an employee who works in a workplace where there's a union that advocates on behalf of its members, that you are benefiting from the union's activities and advocacy on behalf of the employees. So if you're not paying union dues, but you're benefiting from the advocacy they're doing on your behalf, you're a freeloader, is what they call it. The problem is Initiated Measure 23 is an incredible overreach. It would say that if you make the free and voluntary choice not to join a labor union, that they can still come in, dock your paycheck, take money from you to pay union dues, even if you've chosen not to be in the union. Well, South Dakota is a right-to-work state. You do not have to be a member. You cannot legally be required, you cannot be required to join a union in order to have a job. And so this measure is a huge overreach and causes serious problems for those South Dakotans who, for philosophical reasons or whatever, have made the choice not to participate in a labor union.
If they're not a member, they're still not allowed to vote. There's a lot of things they miss out on, but it does not affect their ability to join a union.
That's absolutely correct. And I should mention that none of the views that I have expressed here today are necessarily those of my law firm, Woods, Fuller, Schultz & Smith, or of any of my lobbying or other clients.
Thanks again for coming on this week.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us this week. See us next week also on The Facts.